This century may only be a quarter of the way done, but during that time the world has seen some bizarre mysteries that are yet to be solved. People have gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Crimes have been committed with no suspects being named. And with the advancements of technology, we've seen a rise in cybercrimes that lost a lot of people a lot of money, with no culprit being identified. The Manhattan Project was a groundbreaking achievement, one that came at the expense of many lives. While a covert program, the project held even more dark secrets within, some of which are only coming to light in recent years. Number 10. It was the time of the Second World War, when America had undertaken efforts to develop effective weapons against its enemies. Such efforts, of course, were secret. The United States led its military into disastrous studies and hazardous research. Studies were being conducted into biowarfare, chemical weapons, and tests were being run on mental asylum patients, non-consenting individuals, and the citizens of the country. But among the worst of the research projects was the creation of the most fatal weapon in the world. Codenamed the Manhattan Project, this research program led to the development and testing of a functional atomic weapon. The Doomsday Machine, the destroyer of worlds, was the creation of the first atomic warhead. A weapon capable of mass destruction, and no citizen knew of it until it was too late. The lead-up to the Manhattan Project began in 1938, when 3 chemists working in a Berlin laboratory made a discovery that would alter the course of history as we know it. They had successfully split the uranium atom, and the energy it released was tremendous. Tremendous enough that it could effectively power an explosive. One of those chemists working on this research was none other than Albert Einstein. Despite knowing that this discovery would give them an advantage in weaponry, there were still some technical problems in place. But the Germans were on the case and were figuring out exactly how to overcome said problems. Einstein, alarmed by their revelation, wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, and so the effort to build the atomic warhead was initiated. At the time that Roosevelt began his efforts towards the creation of a nuclear warhead, Germany, under a dictatorship, was also creating a nuclear weapon. To start things off, the president set up a team of scientists and military officials called the Advisory Committee on Uranium, tasked with researching the material's role as a potential weapon. The committee was later changed to the Office of Scientific Research and Development, adding Italian physicist Enrico Fermi to its list of members. Fermi is the creator of the world's first artificial nuclear reactor. In 1942, the Manhattan Project began. It started off with the formation of the Manhattan Engineer District, based in New York, with U.S. Army Colonel Leslie R. Groves leading the whole project. As Fermi and his team were engaged in the research of nuclear chain reactions, other scientists were in the process of producing microscopic samples of pure plutonium. The Canadian government and military officials were engaged in nuclear research at several sites, and soon these efforts would be combined into one project, with the goal of weaponizing nuclear energy. It was at the very beginning of this already covert mission that various things were taking place, things that prompted a vow of secrecy. It wasn't just test explosions here and there. It was radiation, lies, secrets, contamination, human experimentation, and the destruction of the world. Many individuals were involved in the Manhattan Project. The world's leading scientists, engineers, political leaders, military personnel, as well as construction workers and Secret Service agents. One engineer working on the project was Major General Leslie Richard Groves, the commanding general for the Manhattan Engineer District. Groves, the son of a Presbyterian minister, graduated from West Point Military Academy and served in the construction division of the QMG. By the Second World War, he'd obtained the rank of colonel. In 1942, after being promoted to brigadier general, he was placed in charge of the covert project. It was Groves who had arranged the purchase of uranium and select the site for one of the 3 secret cities used in the atomic project. Groves was responsible for recruiting David Boehm, Enrico Fermi, and none other than Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who directed one of the laboratories and was responsible for not only the research, but also the design of the atomic warhead. Aside from being the leader and the coordinator of his engineering sector, Groves was responsible for something else: lying. In 2023, the web was flooded with articles about a new, chilling secret regarding the Manhattan Project, the secret mission whose documents are still being declassified today. The secret was certainly chilling, and it was reluctantly made public. In short, the secret was that Oppenheimer's boss lied continuously about radiation and how it was poisoning the people of America. Those newly declassified documents revealed how General Groves not only misled Congress with regard to the effects of radiation, but he outright lied to the public as well. Initially, his lies were nothing more than ignorance, but as scientists began making new discoveries regarding radiation and its risks to human life, that ignorance turned into flat-out denial and willful deception. Oppenheimer wasn't innocent either. He knew of his boss's lies during the operation, and rather than dispute his claims or confront him, he kept quiet. The formerly classified documents held a memo written by 4 scientists, which was titled Calculated Biological Effects of Atomic Explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Prior to the writing of this memo, it was believed that the victims had succumbed to the blast and heat of the explosion, but that wasn't the case. Multiple fatalities have been caused by radioactive fallout alone. Yet one day before the memo was written, at a press conference, Groves had claimed that the radiation had caused no fatalities, and that claims to the contrary were nothing more than propaganda being spread by Asian newspapers. Months before Hiroshima, in April of that year, during the initial test of the atomic warhead in New Mexico, medical experts within the Manhattan Project had warned Groves of radioactive dust and a toxic cloud. They told him that they needed to evacuate the site, but Groves wasn't about to confirm the so-called propaganda claims or attract media attention. Just days later, the chief medical officer of the project wrote to the general. He spoke of the hazardous radiation and how it extended almost 90 miles out of the site. He also added that there was a tremendous amount of radioactive dust now present in the air. Again, Groves ignored the warnings, and that July, the warhead was dropped on Japan. The general's awareness of the radiation is further supported by an excerpt from his diary, in which he asks if it's safe to allow the press to survey the test site. One scientist responded, "It was almost certainly not safe if the journalist stood as close as 100 feet from the site." Reporters were allowed at the site nonetheless. But the lies didn't end there. A month after the memo was established, more definitive proof of harmful radiation was making itself known. More than 4,000 people were admitted to hospitals in Japan, all of which showed effects of radiation. Half of those patients succumbed to its effects. 3 days later, during a testimony before the Senate Special Committee on Atomic Energy, General Groves was asked about radiation residue at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. His response was, "There is none. That is a very positive none." The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, Watson's Little Albert Experiment, the 1939 Monster Study, MK Ultra, the Milgram Shock Experiments, and Unit 731. History has been marred by the onslaught of unethical, inhumane experiments conducted on non-consenting people, inmates that had no choice in the matter, patients in psychiatric wards, children, and the most frail of our society. It comes as no shock that the Manhattan Project and the era of the Second World War were being further disfigured than they already were. A program dedicated to creating a weapon of mass destruction is bound to have human experimentation thrown into the mix. But the world wouldn't learn about it until later, and the victims never knew what they were subjected to. The human experiments attached to the Manhattan Project began not long after the project itself. At the time, most knew that radiation was dangerous to some degree, but they weren't fully aware of the detrimental effects it could have on human life. Those working on the project, in close proximity to radioactive materials, grew concerned for their health, and so did their leaders. So, in an effort to figure out if working on the production of nuclear weapons posed a health risk to engineers, researchers, and scientists, testing began. At first, scientists were using mice and rats, but the tests proved inconclusive. Instead, the head of the medical team associated with the Manhattan Project, Stafford Warren, suggested human trials, an idea that greatly appealed to the government. In 1945, those human experiments began, and it started with a group of 30 unsuspecting individuals. Those 30 victims were either in financial ruin, powerless, or sick, aspects of their lives that those running the project used as justification. The test subjects were obtained from medical facilities affiliated with the University of Rochester, Chicago, or California, which were associated with the Manhattan Project. They were patients in the affiliated hospitals that had gone there for treatment. Little did they know that they would be secretly injected with the radioactive material. 18 of the patients were injected with plutonium, the silvery white metal that can lead to an elevated risk of lung, bone, and liver cancers. Another 5 non-consenting patients were injected with polonium, a naturally occurring radioactive material which could cause anorexia, throat swelling, and convulsions and comas. Another 6 human subjects were injected with uranium, a radioactive metal and the heaviest naturally occurring element, which can lead to kidney damage, respiratory issues, neurological problems, increased cancer risk, skin irritation, skin damage, and much more. Researchers aimed to collect metabolic data from these experiments and studied them in secret. They were trying to see how much radiation the human body could tolerate. This would allow them to develop new safety protocols. What scientists failed to realize at the time was that the exposure may take decades before it has any effect on the patient. One by one, months, years, or decades later, those injected with radioactive materials began to perish. Not all the names of the victims were publicly released and were instead referred to by code. CHI-1, a 68-year-old individual, passed away just 5 months after being injected. His COD was listed as cancer of the chin and lungs. HP-10, a 52-year-old man, lived to 63 before succumbing to heart disease. CAL-3, a 36-year-old man, lived to 80 years old and passed away from respiratory failure. The youngest of the subjects, a toddler, lived only 8 months before being injected. His COD was bone cancer. HP-7, a 59-year-old woman, lived 9 months and succumbed to pulmonary failure. Radiation can contribute to heart disease, all kinds of cancer, respiratory failure, and can even contribute to the development of Hodgkin's disease. Yet it cannot be confirmed if the injected radioactive materials were responsible for the development of all of these illnesses. In 1993, an expose in the Albuquerque Tribune revealed harsh details of these covert experiments. An investigation led by the Department of Energy was prompted, concluding that the trials had been unethical, and by 1997, a new law was passed that prohibits conducting secret scientific experiments on humans. Something bizarre started happening in the state of Tennessee back in 1943. Young workers from all over began to flood in. They were congregating at a 59,000-acre site that lies west of Knoxville. Quickly following behind the influx of workers was a vast amount of material. Neither the workers nor that material would ever reemerge. On the strange site, houses and facilities began to pop up in record speed. It was as though a whole new neighborhood was being built. And that is precisely what was happening. It was the creation of one of the Manhattan Project's 3 secret cities, Oak Ridge. It was a city that went undocumented on any map. It simply didn't exist to the outside world. The suspicious activity, of course, drew much attention, but it wasn't until years later that they would figure out what was happening there. Despite being in close proximity to the site, none of the residents knew what was happening, and the answer to that was nothing short of troubling. The answer to what was going on here was that Oak Ridge was the starting point of the Manhattan Project, the race against the Germans to build the first ever atomic explosive. It was the beginning of a nuclear war. The city was developed on strict security protocol. Anyone aged 12 or older required an ID badge, and each entrant was frisked. The use of words uranium, atomic, and radioactive were taboo for fear that they would tip off the enemy. It was this site that was picked up by General Leslie Groves, the facility that would pilot the plutonium plant and the uranium enrichment plant. There were 4 production facility sites located in valleys near the town. Among them was Y-12, home of the electromagnetic plane. X-10 contained the experimental plutonium pile and separation facilities. K-25 was the gaseous diffusion plant, and S-50 acted as the thermal diffusion plant. The site had everything that was needed to house, create, separate, and diffuse the materials needed to create the first ever atomic warhead. It also offered residency to those involved in the covert project, including Robert Oppenheimer, Leslie Groves, and Enrico Fermi. To make things worse, among those who lived in Oak Ridge was a group of women who didn't even know that they were helping the United States government create a weapon of mass destruction. But it would be their efforts to finalize the uranium enrichment process that would aid in the development of the destroyer of worlds. The little boy atomic weapon was created here, the same one that would be dropped on Hiroshima. It was July of 1945, 5:30 a.m., when a group of young campers lay on their bunk beds in Ruidoso, New Mexico, an area nearby one of the 3 cities affiliated with the Manhattan Project. A forceful blast threw the campers from their beds, and outside snow was trickling down. They stood beneath the falling flakes, only to discover that the icicles were actually unnaturally warm. The campers cupped their hands in an effort to capture the glistening debris and rubbed it on their faces, and they were having a great time. It wouldn't be until years later when they would figure out why that snow was so hot. It wasn't snow at all. The falling debris was actually fallout from the first nuclear test explosion, the Trinity test. Out of the 12 of those young students, only 1 survived, with the rest succumbing to various types of cancers. This was the hidden tragedy of the Manhattan Project, and those campers were the first victims of the atomic warhead. Citizens, visitors, and campers were unknowingly exposed to the radiation. The blast was a planned test, but no one in its vicinity was warned of the incoming explosion. In the years to come, thousands of residents would inexplicably develop cancers and diseases, believed to have been caused by that nuclear fallout. All across the United States, citizens known as downwinders had been exposed, and for more than 70 years they'd been fighting for recognition. If the wind didn't carry it right into their faces, victims were exposed to the radioactive debris through infected water, crops, land, and livestock. The worst part of all, they weren't told that they'd just come into contact with hazardous material. In fact, the United States government, keen on avoiding panic, told the residents that the blast that they just witnessed was nothing more than an accidental explosion of ammunition. And that was that. The warm snow was just harmless debris. Officials didn't evacuate the area, nor did they tell the residents of the health effects they may be subjected to. The Trinity test site was chosen for its apparent removal from human habitation, but this decision had either been the result of a lie or pure ignorance, because within 150 miles of the explosion, there were 500,000 people residing there. Los Alamos, New Mexico, the second of the 3 secret sites present within the Manhattan Project. It was at this site, codenamed Project Y, that top-secret atomic weapons were being built. At its head was theoretical physicist Oppenheimer, the man responsible for the research and design of the atomic warhead. Los Alamos was so secret that it only had one mailbox as the mailing address that would serve the whole town. The mountainous area allowed the scientists to relax while creating the world-ending weapon. Los Alamos was more of a getaway, a place where one could ski, swim, and even hike. But many of those involved didn't seize this vacation opportunity. They were too busy creating and refining 2 very secret atomic weapons, the Fat Man and Little Boy. The Mark I nuclear warhead named Little Boy became the first nuclear weapon ever used in warfare. On the 6th of August, 1945, it was released by the B-29 Enola Gray over Hiroshima. It was detonated by firing a massive uranium down a cylinder to create a self-sustaining nuclear reaction, producing a force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. Fat Man was an implosion-type weapon that made use of the radioactive material that was injected into those unsuspecting patients earlier, plutonium. The subcritical plutonium sphere would be placed within the hollow sphere of high explosive. On HE's surface were several detonators, which would be fired simultaneously to produce an incredibly powerful inward pressure, creating a squeezing effect, increasing the density and resulting in a nuclear explosion. It was this weapon that would be dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th of August, 1945. Los Alamos saw the convergence of chemists, physicists, explosive experts, and military personnel, Oppenheimer would even organize a weekly meeting where 6 Nobel Prize winners would gather with other notable scientists and engineers. Much like Oak Ridge, this secret city would also consist of various sites. There was the V site, where asbestos buildings were erected to resemble the world's first atomic weapon. Experts would work around the clock at this site. They were busy tinkering with the gadget, the first plutonium-based atomic explosive. The TA-81 site was where engineers and scientists would design weapons like the Little Boy warhead. It was Los Alamos that was responsible for the Trinity test, the first nuclear explosion that saw hidden fatalities. Just 210 miles from the secret city was Jornada del Muerto, where a 100-foot tower stood in the plains. Atop the tower was the plutonium device, the gadget, the same device that experts were working on back at the base in those asbestos buildings. It was that explosive that would detonate at exactly 5:30 that morning, and it saw a blast radius of 150 miles, just a couple miles conveniently short of hitting Los Alamos. For as long as politics have been around, one thing remains consistent. The governments across the countries want to know what the other is up to. So it comes as no shock that the covert Manhattan Project found itself playing host to espionage, and behind it was one man, Klaus Fuchs, the German theoretical physicist. The German citizen joined the German Communist Party back in the 30s, but was forced to flee to Britain in 1933. It was here that he earned a doctorate in physics and obtained a teaching post at Edinburgh University. When the Second World War broke out, Klaus was detained on the Isle of Man before being sent to Canada as a citizen of an enemy nation. In 1941, he returned to Edinburgh, where his expertise would ultimately lead him to be recruited to Tube Alloy's nuclear weapons program. Tube Alloys was the British equivalent of the Manhattan Project. They were also researching nuclear weapons and how they could be used against the enemy. Later that same year, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, Klaus made contact with an exiled German communist named Jurgen Kuczynski, offering the Russian information on the secret Tube Alloys project, and this is where his top-secret espionage mission would begin. After being put in touch with the Russian GRU military intelligence agency, he passed along the secret atomic research. His motivation was that he believed that the Soviets had every right to know about the atomic warhead project. In 1943, not long after the Manhattan Project commenced, Klaus Fuchs was sent to join it as part of a British science team. He was placed in the Los Alamos section in the theoretical division under Edward Teller and Hans Bethe. For the next 3 years, he would play this crucial role. Engaged in the research of nuclear weaponry, Klaus would develop several designs, equations, and techniques, each of which would be used in the final creation of the first atomic warheads. Among his work, the spy specialized in researching implosion methods and focused much of his attention on the detrimental Fat Man weapon. Klaus was also present during the Trinity test, but during those 3 years, Klaus, nicknamed the Atomic Spy, was in contact with the GRU agent, whom he knew only as Raymond. The agent would later become known as Harry Gold, an American citizen who the Russians referred to as Gus, or Goose in Russian. Gold and Spy would meet regularly at various locations where he would pass along crucial top-secret information. This included technical issues relating to the atomic warhead's design. This information, paired with the other information obtained from other spies and other top-secret projects, the Russians were given an advantage and were able to make rapid progress in their projects. Essentially, they were able to make an effective copy of the American atomic explosive design. Klaus would also be able to pass along detailed information on the hydrogen warhead. Experts believe that his intelligence allowed the Soviets to effectively develop and test their own atomic weapon at least 2 years earlier than they were expected to. In 1949, 4 years after the war had ended, the United States Army Signal Intelligence Service's Venona project revealed that there was a Soviet spy in their midst, and he was passing along vital information about their top-secret nuclear discoveries. Klaus Fuchs was a quiet, unassuming individual, one who found himself in an unnerving position to alter the balance of world power, making him the most dangerous scientist in history. In an effort to keep a top-secret project that occasionally sees loud booms, mushroom clouds, and falling debris a secret, the government would need a pretty bulletproof cover. But what cover could be better than gaslighting the masses? The Manhattan Project was only known to a select few, such as military personnel, the government, scientists, construction workers, and the occasional Soviet spy. Most unexpectedly, there was one journalist who knew about the secret mission. That one journalist could have blurted out this immoral research to the public, but instead, William Lawrence's job was exactly the opposite. The Lithuanian immigrant fled from Russia back in 1905 and graduated from Harvard Law School before becoming a reporter. In 1940, he published an article titled "The Atom Gives Up," a piece that revealed Lawrence's stand on nuclear weaponry. He had seen the incredible potential that atomic energy could have. That very article, though, was so alarmingly prophetic that General Leslie Groves ordered that anyone who borrows said article from the library should be reported to him. Anyone who dared touch that article ended up on the suspect list. Lawrence, the two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, was the only member of the press to ever get a close encounter with nuclear weapons research. In 1945, his services were retained by Groves, and he was allowed to witness historic moments like the Trinity test. It was the perfect deal. The New York Times would be able to get a scoop of the century, and in return the Manhattan Project got an atomic energy advocate and an influential individual who would cover their tracks. During the first tests and actual attacks, reports, articles, and news began to circulate. They were against the use of such weapons and cited words like sickness and contamination in national publications. It was just something that the American government couldn't afford to lose. So Lawrence was paid to discredit any and all anti-nuclear reports. In fact, it was this reporter who came up with the cover story of the Trinity test being an accidental ammunition explosion. Following the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks, Japan reports began flooding in, stating that survivors of the blasts had begun experiencing and developing some serious and strange symptoms. Radiation sickness wasn't widely understood at the time, and all they could say was that those affected by the blast were developing never-before-seen symptoms. To counteract this supposed propaganda, Lawrence wrote an authoritative article in which he stated that Geiger counter readings had been taken and assurances had been put into place to reduce the risk of radiation exposure. But this article was simply not true. Perhaps it was a deliberate lie or a mistake, or maybe Lawrence was misinformed, but nonetheless he'd witnessed the incidents firsthand and told a different story, a defense that would ultimately harm his reputation, which he would never recover from. Not only had he covered up radiation sickness and the Trinity test, but he also downplayed the impact of the destructive force made by the atomic blast itself, not just the radiation. The blast had devastated the whole city, but the journalist maintained that it was necessary to end the war. In the modern day, William Lawrence still faces scrutiny for the lies he spread during the Manhattan Project. So much so that many other journalists have called for his Pulitzer Prizes to be taken away due to the unethical, secret exchange in which the American War Department paid him to lie about Hiroshima and other nuclear efforts. Oak Ridge and Los Alamos weren't the only secret cities present in the project. There was a third covert site that saw the production of another radioactive element, plutonium. Nestled away from the public eye in Benton County, Washington, was the Hanford Engineer Works, HEW, or Hanford for short. The 600-square-mile site produced a radioactive material alongside the Columbus River. The site wasn't selected at random, but the government had a particular reason for choosing this specific area. They stationed Hanford here because the river would allow quick and easy access to water that could be used to cool their nuclear reactors and give them ample hydroelectric power. Cooling the reactors was crucial to the operation. They were larger than any other reactor in existence and were set far apart from one another to reduce the likelihood of a single accident that would shut down the entire project. The mild climate, transportation facilities, and its distance from populated areas allowed for swift, secret, and uninterrupted production. It would be at this third secret city that workers would build and operate the world's first ever nuclear production reactors that produced plutonium, synthesizing it from uranium, the very element that was injected into those unsuspecting patients. Plutonium would also be used in the creation of the atomic warhead that detonated during the Trinity test and was used in the Fat Man that saw the destruction of Nagasaki. There were 3 main areas present at the site, including the 100, 200, and 300 area. The 100 area is where the plutonium production reactors were being held. In the 200 area, there was the chemical separation plant, nicknamed the Queen Mary after the ocean liner. There were 2 Queen Marys built in Hanford that went into operation with a load from the B reactor in the 100 area in late December of 1944. The first shipment of plutonium was shipped to Los Alamos in February of 1945, and on the 16th of July of that year, the plutonium-filled warhead detonated near Alamogordo. Aside from being in the area in which the world-ending material was produced, Hanford also posed a serious risk to workers, unbeknownst to them. Citizens weren't the only ones being lied to. Some workers had no idea that they were dealing with such hazardous materials that would later come back to haunt them. They would work with high voltages, toxic chemicals, and dangerous radioactive elements. Despite these conditions, workers continued the operation from December of 43 to December of 46. Enriched uranium would be sent from Oak Ridge to Hanford to be synthesized, and then it was shipped to Los Alamos, where the atomic warheads were being manufactured. Even though the Manhattan Project ended years earlier, Hanford continued to produce nuclear weapons until 1971. One of the most bizarre aspects of the Manhattan Project was that it was almost found out by a pioneering technology company, Kodak, and it all started with the Trinity test. The Trinity test was the first nuclear warhead test that occurred on the 16th of July in 1945. A plutonium implosion device was tested at a site 210 miles south of Los Alamos. It was the plains of the Alamogordo Range, the Jornada del Muerto. This covert test was codenamed Trinity, and it was this very explosion that was covered up as an ammunition accident. Atop a 100-foot tower was the plutonium device called the Gadget, and it detonated at exactly 5:30 that morning. It released 18.6 kilotons of power, vaporizing the tower and turning the surrounding sand into green glass. Seconds later, the blast of the explosion sent heat all across the desert, knocking observers to the ground. Witnesses had spotted the explosion hundreds of miles away. Many described it as a flash of fire followed by thick black smoke. It was an event that lit up the sky like the sun. The Trinity blast affected thousands of citizens in the vicinity, including some campers, but it also affected a different aspect, the Kodak company. Even before the Second World War broke out, film companies were taking measures to protect their film from radiation, which could seriously damage their shots. But in the mid-40s, the company noticed something strange. A peculiar spotting had formed on some of their films. At the time, there was a scientist working for the company who figured out exactly why the film was spotting. Dr. J.H. Webb studied the matter and figured out that it was caused by the nuclear explosion that must have taken place somewhere in the United States. In fact, it had come from the first nuclear weapon explosion. After realizing that this is what had happened, the scientist was contacted by a Los Alamos employee. In a classified memo that has since been declassified, the employee indicated that the blast had contaminated a nearby river in Indiana. It turned out this was the same water that Kodak used to produce their cardboard film containers. The water was used in a cardboard pulp mill, and recognizing the sensitivity of the situation, Webb waited until 1949 to publish the story in the open literature, instead of releasing it as a secret operation. In response to the event, the company installed air sensors in the intake of the building's ventilation system to detect for potential nuclear fallout that nobody would be warned of. Webb could have exposed the top-secret Manhattan Project, but chose not to, allowing the creation of the first atomic warhead to remain a detrimental secret. And if the film was botched by radiation, then the fallout of the Trinity test runs far further than estimated. If it contaminated water sources, it's traveled unnervingly far, affecting not only mill workers, but anyone who uses their products. In the year 2000, 23-year-old Peggy Ashley was working at Federal Mogul in Scottsville, Kentucky. She had 3 children, 2 of whom were living with their respective fathers in other parts of the country. She was in a relationship with a man, but it seemingly wasn't a very happy one. since she finished her shift at work on the 27th of July and then got into an argument with him, during which she alleged that he assaulted her with a weapon of some kind. She drove straight to the nearest sheriff's department to file a report about the assault and remained there until around 1:30 a.m. She then got back in her car and traveled to the parking lot of the A.O. Smith Electrical Motor Plant, but she wasn't alone. Surveillance footage from the parking lot shows Peggy arriving and another car pulling up behind her, clearly having followed her there. The footage then shows her getting out of the car, walking over to a white truck belonging to Calvin Smith, and getting in. Smith then left the area, and Peggy was never seen or heard from again. She'd left her child with a babysitter for the night, but when she didn't return, the sitter wasn't too concerned, since she was known to leave her child with sitters for longer than she intended, on one occasion having left her small daughter behind when she left with a truck driver, just as she did on the night that she vanished forever. On that occasion, she came home after a week, but this time, when she still wasn't home 2 days later, the babysitter decided to contact the police. She explained what had happened, and a missing person case was opened. When Smith, the truck driver, was interviewed, he claimed to have an alibi, stating that he did indeed pick Peggy up, but that she asked to be taken to a payphone. He obliged, and according to him, she made a call, after which she got back into his truck and asked to be taken back to her car, which was still sitting in the A.O. Smith parking lot. But when this story was checked out, it didn't add up. Investigators checked the payphone and discovered no calls had been made from it that night. When they checked security footage from the parking lot, they saw Peggy get into Smith's truck, but found that they never returned as he claimed. Her friends and family tried to get in touch with her, but got no answer on her phone. Peggy's bank accounts were monitored, but showed no activity after the night she disappeared, which led investigators to believe she might have been a victim of foul play. Her boyfriend was brought in for questioning, but his alibi checked out and he was ruled out as a suspect. The only person left to investigate was Smith, and he was promptly named as a person of interest in Peggy's disappearance, and a barn on his property in Munfordville was searched, but to no avail. Peggy's case has since gone cold, as no new leads have been received, and she's never been located. If you have any helpful information that could help track Peggy down, you're asked to contact the Allen City Sheriff's Department at 270-237-3210. Peggy's nameless case number is MP64. Cryptocurrency has taken the world by storm, with some people investing millions of dollars in hopes that they'll one day be able to cash out even more. But as most of us know, cryptocurrency comes with a risk, as is evidenced by a case from 2018 in which investors in Coincheck, one of Japan's largest cryptocurrencies, lost their investments after a hacker managed to infiltrate their network. Coincheck was founded in Tokyo in 2012 and employed a total of 71 people, and its base is located in the Shibuya district, where many other startups have had their origins. Many of those didn't make it past their first year, but Coincheck proved to be successful until January of 2018 when the hacker struck. The incident took place over 2 days, the 26th and 27th of January of that year. The hacker, who's never been identified, managed to convince several Experty initial coin offering customers to send Ethereum funds to a wallet that he had set up, and which did not belong to Experty. The investors who paid into this wallet expected to receive tokens in exchange for their money, but it was soon discovered that the email they received announcing a pre-ICO sale was spurious and that the money had been transferred to the incorrect wallet. The hack took place at 2:57 a.m., but the company only became aware of it at 11:25, more than 8 hours later. When the damage was assessed, it was found that 523 NEMs had been fraudulently transferred from the company's address, resulting in a loss of 58 billion yen, or around $385,000. The company started scrambling to mitigate the damage, but they were unsure whether the attack originated in Japan or from a foreign country. They were also able to track where the money was sent to, and attempted to track the missing funds but were unable to recover any of it. The breach was reported to the police, but there was little they could do to try and identify the hacker. The incident caused the value of Bitcoin, arguably the most famous of all cryptocurrencies to drop by 3.4%. It was quickly becoming clear that the company would not be able to return their clients' assets, and the theft had a lasting impact on cryptocurrency regulations. Coincheck was ordered by the Financial Services Agency to improve its security systems, such as ensuring that its users first needed to confirm their identities when they first opened an account. The company did, however, use its capital to reimburse their clients who'd been affected by the hack, and after improving their security in areas that were found to be vulnerable, they started clawing their way back from the massive loss. While the hack came as a shock to many people, it also had a positive impact on the industry, as security standards are now much tighter and will further improve as time goes by. Case involving the disappearance of 42-year-old Melissa Montoya quickly went cold after she disappeared in New Mexico in 2001. But hope has been renewed after a new tip came in 2004, and her family is hopeful that she will finally be located. On the 9th of March 2001, Melissa enjoyed a night out in Dulce, New Mexico, specifically on the Jicarilla Apache National Reserve. At the time, she was living in Colorado with her boyfriend, but she would often visit Dulce, her hometown, since it was just 30 minutes away. She's described by those who knew her as a strong woman, not only mentally, but also physically, since she worked on a ranch. But she was struggling with a relationship at the time, since her boyfriend had been physically abusive towards her, and over time she became too scared to leave him for fear of what might happen. When she traveled to Dulce on that last occasion, though, her friends were certain that the relationship would finally come to an end. On the night of her disappearance, she and a friend of hers, Ree Vicente, went to a bar called the Apache House of Liquor, better known to locals as the Zoo. That night, she spoke to one of her cousins, who would later report that she felt as if Melissa was about to finally break up with her boyfriend, since she told her that she was now single. The two spent most of the night catching up, something they couldn't do while Melissa's boyfriend was around, and Ree would tell the police that Melissa seemed off, as if she was worried about something. She then saw Melissa talking to a man, who Ree thought was her boyfriend, and although she couldn't hear what they were saying, she believes they got into an argument. Melissa eventually asked the man to leave her alone. The two friends spent the next hour chatting, after which the same man approached them and told Melissa that it was time for them to leave. She and the man then left the bar together, and she was never seen again. When Melissa didn't return home and failed to contact any of her family members, she was reported as missing, and initially her boyfriend was considered a suspect. His house and the surrounding property were searched, but nothing of value was found. He claimed not to have seen her that night, despite several witness reports to the contrary. People that were in the bar that night were interviewed, but no one knew what happened to Melissa after she left that night. Strangely, her boyfriend passed away shortly after her disappearance, and a short while after that, his house burned down. The case went cold, but 24 years after she disappeared, a woman came forward to report that her boyfriend had had an interaction with Melissa's boyfriend that night, but investigators have declined to release any further details about this new development. Anyone who has information on her whereabouts is urged to contact the Jicarilla Apache National Police Department at 575-759-3222. The city of Forest Grove in Oregon is considered to be a relatively quiet area, but in 2016, its residents had their peace and quiet shattered when a strange and still unidentified sound pierced the air, and it's never been identified. The first time that the sound was heard was in January of that year, when a resident, Paula Lynch, became aware of a strange, high-pitched noise that she couldn't identify. Several other people then also started hearing it over the course of several nights, but they couldn't figure out where it was coming from or what was producing it. They described it as a mechanical screeching noise, similar to a train braking on its tracks. Others described it as similar to a flute being played in an incorrect pitch, a whistle, or a tea kettle that had been left on the stove for too long. It became known as the Forest Grove Shriek, and Paula would report that she'd heard the same noise 4 times in the following months, and that it would suddenly become noticeable at different times of the day. On the 12th of February, she heard it again in the dead of night, and this time she had her phone at hand to record a video. She then posted the video to the city's Facebook page, and from there it spread like wildfire. Many people who watched the clip likened it to two pieces of metal being scraped against each other, or steam rushing out of a pipe that had burst. They all agreed on one thing, though, that the sound was intensely annoying, and hence residents wanted it located and stopped as soon as possible. They reported the sound to city officials, who started investigating, but they soon found that they had no idea what the sound was or where it was coming from. One man told a media outlet that it seemed to emanate from the middle of a street, but that he couldn't figure out what was causing it. Others were certain that it was being caused by a nearby train stopping, but they were told that there were no tracks near Paula's house, and if there were, she would have instantly known where the sound was coming from. It was then suggested it may be caused by a faulty water valve, but this also wasn't the case. Next, the city checked for gas leaks, but none were found. Some people suggested that a wildfire may have broken out nearby, but no fires were reported. Fire alarms in houses and businesses in the area were checked, but none were found to be malfunctioning. And before long, officials had no choice but to admit that they couldn't locate the source of the sound, and that they had no solution. While most people were looking for a logical and practical cause, others took to the internet to spread conspiracy theories, claiming that the sound was being produced by extraterrestrial crafts, or that it was a warning sign that something bad was about to happen in the city. The mystery was all the more intriguing by the fact that only a few people had heard the noise, and so it was impossible to predict when it would next occur, and when it did, it could not be traced. People who had heard the sound were asked to pin the location where they heard it on a map, and it was found that it was heard in 30 different spots in the city. Then one day, the sound suddenly stopped, and it's never been heard again, ensuring that this mystery will never be solved. 23-year-old Frederick Joseph Boehm has been missing since the 25th of January 2001, and his case has continued to baffle investigators in the decades that have since passed. Frederick, known to his friends and family as Little Joe, hailed from Marshall, Texas, where he quickly grew fond of the outdoors. He would spend much of his time fishing and hunting, something that he still loved to do before he disappeared. In 2001, he was living in Coley Briggs, his best friend's family's house on Victory Drive in Marshall. He was in a relationship with the woman and at the time was having some medical issues, as he'd been suffering from blackouts and had been prescribed antidepressants. The last time that he was seen, Frederick was at his friend's house. Also present were his friend, his girlfriend, their children, and his friend's mother, who was spending time at the house visiting her son and grandchildren. The group spent some time catching up, and at around 11 p.m., Frederick had gotten ready and dressed for bed when his phone rang. He took the call, after which he changed his clothes and left the house. According to those in the house, he walked down Victory Drive and headed downtown. As he left the house, he passed his friend's girlfriend on the house's porch and told her that he'd be back in the morning. When no one had heard from him, by the 3rd of February, 9 days after he was last seen, he was reported missing by his sister. She'd only just learned that he never came home that morning, but inexplicably his friends never contacted the police. Frederick had to walk wherever he was going that night since his truck had been involved in a crash and was inoperable. Hence, investigators were hopeful that he would be tracked down since he didn't have a vehicle to travel in. Searches of the surrounding area where he was last seen were carried out, but no clues were found as to where he might have been heading after leaving the house that night. In the weeks that followed, 2 people contacted the authorities to report that they'd seen Frederick walking around town in Marshall, but it was never confirmed whether this was really him. No further leads have come in since the day that he disappeared, leading his family, friends, and investigators to believe that something nefarious happened to him, and that it may have something to do with the phone call that he received before setting out. Frederick's sister says that she hasn't been contacted by the police in years, and hence believes that they're no longer actively looking for him. But the Marshall Police Department insists that the case is still open, and that any new leads that are received will be followed up on. Anyone who can aid in this investigation can contact the Marshall Police Department at 903-935-4546. The family of 32-year-old Susana Torres is desperate to find out what happened to her after CCTV footage emerged of her being abducted on the 11th of April, 2021. It was initially believed that she'd simply gone missing, but it soon became clear that foul play was involved. Susana is described by her family as a very happy person who loved being out and about, and above all, spending time with her family. She had 2 children and was married to Javier Chavez, but the couple's marriage had fallen apart by this time and they were estranged. In fact, things had gotten so bad between the pair that Susana had filed for a restraining order against Javier, something that he took exception to. He had, according to some sources, attempted to abduct her once before in March of 2021, but was unsuccessful. But on the 11th of April, Susana was in Richie's Mini Mart in her hometown of Modesto, California, when she was approached once more by Javier, who was in breach of the restraining order against him. The couple's 2 children were seated in the back of her car, while Susana was shopping in the store, and in the footage that was later released by the police, she could be seen being led out by Javier, who's believed to have had a firearm pointed at her. Susana was then led to the car and told to get in via the driver's seat. Javier then forced her over into the passenger seat and drove away with his 3 victims in the car. Fortunately, he decided to drive to his parents' house later that night, where he dropped the 2 children off safely before leaving again. In the video, many people are present in the parking lot while the kidnapping is taking place, but Torres did it so surreptitiously that no one seemed to notice. Investigators then asked anyone who recognized themselves in the footage, or who was in the vicinity of the mini-mart between 5:35 and 5:50 p.m. that day to come forward. They also made sure to explain that the timestamp on the video was incorrect for some reason, and that the incident took place between these specific times. It's also been revealed that this was not the first restraining order that Susana had taken out against Torres. She told the police that he'd assaulted her on several occasions, and after she was able to provide proof of these incidents, a warrant for his arrest was issued. But investigators were unable to track him down before he enacted his second kidnapping attempt. But before this incident, Torres had often ignored the restraining orders against him and kept harassing Susana, who called the police on several occasions, but was told that there was nothing they could do unless her life was in danger. 4 years have passed since Susana was taken against her will, but her family still hopes that she will be found and returned to her children. It's been speculated that she and Torres may be in Mexico, since he was once seen near the Tijuana airport, but by the time that the police got there, he'd moved on. If you have any information that could help track Susana or Torres, you're asked to contact Detective Somerton at 209-525-7032. In June of 2020, 78-year-old Gordon Bruce White was living on Dent Bridge Road in Orofino, Ohio. He was not doing well medically at the time, since he'd been diagnosed with dementia, and as time went by, his condition started to worsen, and it's believed that this contributed to his sudden and unexplained disappearance. On the afternoon of the 10th of June of that year, Gordon decided to ride his ATV around on his property and was seen doing so by several witnesses who knew him. They stated that they last saw him around 4 p.m. that afternoon, but that they've not seen or heard from him since. When it became apparent that he'd gone missing later that evening, his concerned friends and neighbors searched the surrounding neighborhood and asked locals if they'd spotted him, but no one had. When his house was checked, it was discovered that he didn't take his wallet or cell phone with him, which dealt a blow to the investigation since he could not be tracked using his phone. It also meant that he didn't have an immediate way of contacting his family or to call for help if he needed it. When Gordon still hadn't returned to his house by 11 p.m., his neighbors filed a missing person report with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Office, who immediately started searching for him, knowing that he had dementia, and so was very vulnerable out on the streets by himself. The rest of his property was searched that night and into the following morning, and at around 4:45 a.m., searchers came across the ATV that he was seen riding. It hadn't sustained any damage and still had plenty of gas in its tank, but they saw no sign of the missing man, which they found strange, as they didn't believe he could have walked far from the vehicle. When he still hadn't been located by daybreak, the search effort intensified. 6 dog teams were brought in to search for Gordon's scent, but they were unable to trace him. A helicopter started searching from the air in hopes that searchers would be able to spot his clothing from the air, but nothing was found. Searchers scoured the property on ATVs, motorcycles, and on foot for several hours, but to no avail, and the mystery of Gordon's disappearance only deepened. In the end, investigators, volunteers, and experienced search and rescue teams searched for Gordon for a total of 11 days without any positive results, and he remains missing to this day, with no indication of where he may have gone that afternoon. Investigators welcome any leads that come in. Anyone who has any additional information on this case can contact the Clearwater County Sheriff's Office at 208-476-4521. Gordon's nameless case number is MP70857. Credit card companies are constantly under pressure to ensure the security of their customers' finances, but hackers and other criminals can be just as enterprising, as they're also constantly looking for ways to get a hold of people's credit card numbers. In January of 2000, the online music retailer CD Universe was caught in a mad scramble when they were informed by a hacker using the moniker Maxim that he'd found a security flaw in the company's financial security software. CD Universe was seemingly unaware of the breach until they were informed of the email, which was sent to the New York Times. The hacker, who described himself as a 19-year-old living in Russia, added that he had sent the company a fax in which he stated that he would destroy all the files containing credit card numbers in exchange for $100,000. But the company, likely not wanting to be intimidated, refused his offer, and so the hacker went to work. He accessed a website called Max's Credit Card Pipeline, where he published 25,000 of the stolen credit card numbers, leading to the site being shut down a short while later. But the ordeal was far from over. Maxim claimed that he had access to over 300,000 credit card numbers, and that he had used some of the numbers to draw cash, though none of the cardholders ever reported seeing any strange activity on their statements. This meant that he still held hundreds of thousands of customers' numbers, all of which could be published onto the internet at any time. The FBI was informed, and they started investigating the case, but with no way of telling where the hack had originated from, there wasn't much hope that the hacker could be tracked down. To prove that he was serious, Maxim sent 198 of the numbers to the New York Times, and when they were checked, they were found to be genuine. To make matters worse, CD Universe's parent company, E-Universe of Wallingford, was unable to find the flaw in the company's security software, and they'd hired a specialist to bolster its website against further attacks. Upon hearing of the breach, E-Universe immediately began contacting customers to let them know to cancel their credit card numbers, informing each of them of what had happened. Customers were told that their respective financial institutions would issue new credit cards to those customers who'd been affected, and that the company had a fraud guarantee that would ensure that any unauthorized transactions would be refunded back to the affected cardholder. As a general rule, most credit card companies have a similar guarantee, and in some cases, when someone's card is used without their permission, they're only responsible for the first $50 that's spent, with the rest being refunded to them. It later came to light that even if Maxim was tracked down, he would likely not face prosecution, since the electronic evidence that was collected in the aftermath of the hack was not correctly processed. This meant that the evidence had been tainted, and that the hacker had gotten away with this crime. Nevertheless, the case remains under investigation in hopes that the hacker will be identified, even if there's no way to prosecute them. But to date, no new clues have been found, and it seems that this is one crime that'll never be solved. Many of us will attest to the fact that we hated math class in school. While some students are seemingly born with the ability to understand the subject, others struggle to make sense of it, even after graduating from high school. But this is no longer a problem for a man named Jason Paget, who, without knowing it, became a math genius in 2002, after he was attacked and robbed while spending a night out with some of his friends. Jason hails from Alaska, where before the incident he worked as a futon salesman. By his own admission, he considered himself to be somewhat of a shallow person, who mostly concentrated on women, drinking, nursing hangovers, and doing it all over again the next night. He very rarely thought about math, and in fact admits that he used to think it was stupid and unnecessary, since he never seemed to have a use for it as an adult out in the real world. He says that not only did he truly believe this, but he used to think that this was quite an intelligent point of view. But his mind was changed in more than one way on the 13th of September 2002, when he was once again out drinking at a karaoke bar. At one point in the night, he stepped outside when he was approached and then attacked by two men who then stole his leather jacket, which was, he says, already in bad condition. Recalling the incident, he says he heard someone running up behind him and a moment later felt a thud to the back of his head. He saw a flash of bright light in front of his eyes, and before he knew it, he was on his knees with the world spinning around him. He had no idea where he was or what had just happened to him, but he managed to cross the street to a hospital where he explained his situation and received treatment. He was told that he'd suffered a concussion and damage to his kidney. He was given pain medication and sent on his way, but his life would be irrevocably changed. He became afraid of leaving his house and would stock up on as much food as possible so that he wouldn't have to go shopping very often. He covered his windows with blankets and sealed his front door with expanding foam. He started obsessively washing his hands out of fear of germs and realized that the world looked different, as if it had been warped somehow, appearing to him like some kind of retro video game. He also suddenly had a huge interest in math and spent hours on the internet reading about it. E.H. started drawing shapes and fractals that he believed held the key to the universe. When a physicist saw his drawings one day, he informed Jason that he was actually drawing complex mathematical structures. The man convinced him to take a math course, which Jason then did, and he started to realize that he suddenly had a thorough understanding of the subject. It would later be revealed that he'd suffered a brain injury that caused him to develop synesthesia, which causes the brain's signals to get mixed up. This meant that everyday objects appeared to him as mathematical structures or shapes, and that he had acquired savant syndrome. He's since published a book called Struck by Genius, and has traveled extensively, informing people of the importance of math and telling the story of how he became an accidental genius. 24-year-old Sunny Pua originally hails from Champaign, Illinois, but at the time of her mysterious disappearance in 2020, had moved to Lawrenceville, Georgia, where she regularly attended church, and according to those who knew her, was a very talented student. She was in the habit of keeping in touch with her family, but they haven't heard from her in over 4 years, and understandably, they're concerned for her well-being, since they have no idea where she is or what happened to her. The last time that Sunny was seen was on New Year's Eve of 2020, when she was visiting her sister at her apartment on Stillwater Road in Lawrenceville. She left the apartment at around 11 p.m. that night, and seemingly vanished without a trace. Strangely, it was later discovered that her phone was turned off as soon as she left, which her family and investigators think was very suspicious. After she was reported missing, Sunny's family informed the police that she'd been involved in a strange incident a month earlier. On that occasion, she was found in the back of someone's truck that was parked out in the woods in Riverdale, south of Atlanta, and when she was tracked down, she stated that she'd been assaulted. She'd been out in the woods for 2 days before being found, and she was taken to a hospital. There, she was examined, and despite staff being told that she was suffering from mental health problems, they found nothing wrong with her, and she was sent home. She then moved to Lawrenceville. Searches of the area proved unsuccessful, but Sunny's father received a call from someone in November of 2021, who claimed to have seen her that September in Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, specifically at a Boost Mobile store on 3rd Avenue South. Her father traveled to the area and spent 5 days searching for her and handing out flyers. During this time, he learned that she'd been spotted by several other people who claimed that she was in the company of 2 unknown individuals. These sightings were never confirmed, but as soon as Sunny's father spoke to the police about the lead, they assigned an investigator to the Myrtle Beach area. They also distributed her photo and spread the news about her case in case someone had new information, but no one ever came forward. With all leads dried up and no new witnesses being found, Sunny's family decided to hire a private investigator, but he was also unable to make any inroads into the case and finally stated that he believes she was a victim of trafficking, though this has also never been proven. Her family believes that she is still alive and has vowed to never stop looking for her until she's found. They believe that she may be held captive and that she has no way of reaching out to them or the police for help. One of Sunny's college friends, Angelica, has set up a GoFundMe page, and all the donations received will be paid to the private investigator so that he can continue looking for fresh leads. If she is ever found, the remainder of the donations will be used for her rehabilitation if needed. For the time being, though, Sunny remains missing and her fate is unknown. If you have any information that could help track Sunny down, you're asked to contact the Myrtle Beach Police Department at 843-918-1300. When 43-year-old Trevor Basil went missing in 2020, a massive search effort resulted in volunteers from the community supporting his loved ones while they tried to locate him. But despite everyone's best efforts, he still remains missing today. Trevor hails from Panka in Nevada, and in August of that year, he decided to travel to a set of hills just outside of town where he planned to do some rock hunting. He was known to have a passion for collecting rocks and had been to this very area many times in the past. He told his family that he'd be back home later that evening, the 14th of August, as was his usual habit when rock hunting. But when he didn't return as planned, they became worried that he might have gotten lost somehow or suffered an injury that prevented him from seeking aid. They were familiar with the area that he had traveled to, and so they launched a search. They became even more concerned when they found his vehicle near Miller's Wash, which is located deep within the wilderness. When they failed to find any further clues as to where he may have gone, they contacted police and filed a missing person report. The next day, search efforts began not only by the police and search crews, but by as many as 100 volunteers from the area, all of whom were eager to find Trevor so that he could return home safely. The local sheriff's office coordinated the search of Miller Wash after starting outside Panka Market. Search dogs were brought in to help, and almost immediately they found Trevor's scent and started tracking him. They followed the scent for 7 miles through the hills and some rugged terrain, and eventually they found the area where Trevor had been rock hunting. They knew he'd spent some time there since the bucket that he used to store his rocks in was found with some rocks still inside. They also found a towel that belonged to the missing man, and hopes of finding him rather quickly were high. But as the day progressed, this hope started to fade, as none of the searchers were able to find any further clues. Helicopters and drones were used to search from the air, since it's usually easier to spot someone's clothing that way, but to no avail. And by nightfall, nothing of any further use had been uncovered. The search was called off for the day, but resumed the following morning. Even more volunteers had arrived on horseback, ATVs, side-by-sides, and on foot, and they started a grid search with the aid of the authorities. The search dogs were still on Trevor's trail, but as daylight started to fade on the second day, they lost his scent, and it was decided that it would be pointless to keep searching the same area, since Trevor clearly was no longer there. Day 3 of the search proved to be a tough one, since the area was experiencing a heat wave of record-breaking proportions. The Nevada Department of Forestry arrived to aid in the search, which was conducted closer to the area where Trevor's vehicle was found. 12 hours later, they came up empty-handed, and hopes of finding him started to dwindle quickly. A few more searches were conducted in the area, but Trevor was never found, and his fate remains unknown. Anyone who knows what happened to Trevor can contact the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office at 775-962-5151. 36-year-old Robert Michael Bobo has been missing for 27 years after he disappeared from the Woodruff Meadows area in the Siskiyou National Forest of Oregon, and his case continues to baffle his family and investigators as he's never been located. Concerns for his well-being are high, since he isn't the first person to go missing in this area, and many of those cases have also never been solved. According to witnesses, a group of hunters who were in the area that day saw Robert arrive at his Woodruff Meadows campsite on the 2nd of October as he was being dropped off by an unknown woman. They told investigators that they saw him at around 9 a.m., and it would later be revealed that he was planning on staying in the area for several weeks, since he was employed as a part-time woodcutter. It was also confirmed that he was staying at the campsite alone. One of his friends stated that Robert had arranged with them to pick him up again the next morning, but when they arrived, he wasn't there and could not be located. He was supposed to go hunting with that same friend, since the hunting season had just started, and hence they found it worrisome that he wasn't at his campsite as planned. But it was assumed that he was still in the area since he didn't own a vehicle and could not have traveled far, and his friend contacted the National Forest Rangers, who opened a missing person investigation and started organizing a search party. As soon as news of Robert's disappearance reached his friends and family, they knew something was wrong, since he was an experienced outdoorsman, but had left all of his gear, including his favorite hat, at the campsite. They also knew that he was extremely familiar with the area, and hence rejected the theory that he may have gotten lost, suggesting that something more sinister may have happened to him. At his campsite, investigators recovered his 2 firearms that he used for hunting, as well as all of his clothing and all of his camping equipment. They were informed that he didn't have any money on him, and hence had no means by which to leave the area on his own. The first area to be searched was around the campsite, but no clues were found. It wasn't known in which direction the search should be aimed. When the first day of searching ended with no positive result, investigators told his family that they found no sign of foul play, but added that they didn't think he left the area on his own. Several more searches were carried out in the days that followed, but not a single trace of Robert or clues to his whereabouts were found. It was suggested that he may have suffered a medical emergency and left the campsite, but since he's never contacted his friends and family, his disappearance is still considered as suspicious by investigators. In the years that have since passed, his family has returned to the site many times to look for clues, but they've never made any further progress in tracking him down. They believe he was indeed a victim of foul play, but have been unable to prove it. If you have any information on Robert's case, you're asked to contact the Jackson County Sheriff's Office at 541-774-6800. The disappearance of 19-year-old Jeremiah Jamal Parker is one that has left many people, including his family, baffled, since he ventured just a short distance away from his car before suddenly vanishing, as if into thin air. In April of 2004, Jeremiah was working at a Wendy's, and by all accounts he was a diligent and trustworthy employee. He was also studying at the Baton Rouge Community College and was known to be very close with his family. He'd never spent a night away from home without letting them know where he was and when he planned to return, which makes his disappearance 21 years ago all the more inexplicable. On the day of his disappearance, the 11th of April 2004, Jeremiah had been spending some time with his cousin in Sherwood Forest Park in Baton Rouge. They were in his red 1993 Pontiac Grand Am, and at around 6 p.m., Jeremiah parked the vehicle in the northwest corner of the park. He told his cousin that he had earlier lost his cell phone holder in that area, close to a fishing pond, and that he was quickly going to look for it. His cousin remained in the car with the engine running, assuming he'd only be gone for a few minutes. But this was not the case. When he didn't return, his cousin searched the area, but could find no trace of him. He then informed the police, and Jeremiah was reported missing. When the area was searched, his cell phone and just one of his shoes were found about 50 yards from the area where his car was parked, but nothing more was ever found. The fact that he disappeared so close to his car has resulted in many theories being put forward to explain what happened to him. He had watched the film The Passion of the Christ a few days earlier, and according to his family, it had a profound effect on him. Hence, it's been suggested that he left the area willingly, and that he started a new life somewhere new, possibly in Canada. The bodies of water in the area are known to contain alligators, and some people feel that he may have ventured too close and that he was attacked by one of the creatures. It's also been suggested he may have encountered someone while searching for his cell phone cover, and that he was then abducted for unknown reasons, but no evidence to support this theory has ever been found. As is often the case with such unexplainable disappearances, many people are adamant that the case has a supernatural element to it, but many people believe there has to be a more reasonable explanation. The fact that only one of his shoes was ever found suggests that foul play may have been involved, since he could have been running away from someone. And since he didn't return for his cell phone, this theory is plausible, but it's never been confirmed due to a lack of evidence. Anyone with information on Jeremiah's case is asked to contact the Baton Rouge Police Department at 225-389-2000. When 30-year-old George Panka traveled to the Upper Yosemite Falls Trail in June of 2011, the group that he was traveling with could have never expected that by the end of the day, they would have a genuine mystery on their hands, as George had disappeared and was nowhere to be found. George was one of 80 people from a church group who had decided to visit the national park on the 17th of June that year. At the time, he was living with his mother in Hawthorne, California, and had no real experience in the outdoors. In fact, he likely never would have gone on the hike if it weren't for the fact that he loved spending time with his church group. And that morning, he left the house carrying a blue cloth bag that contained a small amount of food and water. But he may not have been prepared for the hike, since the Upper Yosemite Falls Trail is a challenging one to even experienced hikers. But the group decided to forge ahead and take it at a steady pace. The trail usually takes about 6 hours to complete, but it contains a few problematic sections where sand covers stone, and hence it's easy to slip and fall. Most hikers start the trail early in the morning to avoid high temperatures, since very little shade is available. But the hike is well worth it, since it affords visitors excellent views of waterfalls in the area and the vistas around the trail. Out of the 80 people in the group, only about 20 decided to take on the hike, one of whom was George. They set out late in the morning while temperatures were still reasonable, and they reached their destination at the falls just before 3 p.m. They spent some time taking in the views, after which they decided to head back down at their own pace and meet up again at the lodge. Everyone made it down safely, with the exception of George, but it was assumed that he simply decided to hike to another area, and he wasn't reported missing straight away. But when he still hadn't returned to the lodge by 9 p.m., they knew something was wrong, and park rangers were informed. The search was started that same night, but the full-scale effort could only be started the next day, since it was already dark. Hopes were high that George would be tracked down since temperatures weren't too high, and since he was known to have had some water with him. Searchers from the surrounding counties joined in on the search, along with helicopters and search dogs, but they were unable to find any sign of the missing man. For a week, the surrounding trails in the park were thoroughly searched, but nothing was found. The search was eventually called off, and to this day, no one knows what happened to George. If you have any information that could lead to George being found, you're asked to contact the Yosemite National Park Service at 209-379-1992. The case of the disappearance of 18-year-old Dayl Pua highlights the fact that certain areas in the wilderness are classified as off-limits for a reason. A warning that, if he had heeded, may have saved his life. Dayl, who is better known to his friends and family as Moke, hailed from South Kona on Hawaii's Big Island. He had plans of becoming a pastry chef after graduating from high school, and in his spare time enjoyed photography, spending time in the outdoors and going to the beach. On the 27th of February, 2015, he was visiting his grandmother in Oahu, and for some unknown reason, decided that he wanted to hike the Haiku Stairs, a trail that's been marked off as off-limits due to being extremely dangerous. He told his grandmother of his plans, and she did her best to dissuade him, but he was adamant, and that morning he was spotted as he boarded a bus, after which he traveled to the area known as the Stairway to Heaven. His hike started out fine, as he took several photos of the area that he then posted to social media, but when night fell, he still hadn't returned as promised, and he was reported missing. Investigators soon learned that Dayl had initially promised his grandmother that he would stay away from the trail, but that he followed through with his plans anyway. To decide where to start the search, investigators took a close look at the photos that he took, and in one image, they found something unsettling. In the background of one photo, a man could be seen lingering, and it's assumed that Dayl never spotted him, since he was hard to pick out among the surrounding flora. This gave rise to several theories, many of which suggested that he was attacked by the stranger in the background, or that he may have been abducted. His family is adamant that the man must have been following Dayl, but this has never been proven. There is, of course, a good chance that the man was simply also hiking the trail, and that he had nothing to do with Dayl's disappearance. But since he's never come forward, this cannot be confirmed. It's been suggested that he simply kept quiet all these years, since he wasn't supposed to be on the trail, and hence was just an innocent bystander. Search efforts were hampered by rain, which made the stairs slippery and even more dangerous, and at one point, hikers reported hearing someone calling for help, but that person was never found, and it remains unknown whether it was Daylin. Those hikers who heard the screams aided in the search again in the days that followed, but they never heard the voice again, and Daylin was never located. It's assumed that he slipped on the perilous path and fell, and that he eventually succumbed to the elements. Anyone with information on Daylin's case is urged to contact the Honolulu Police Department at 808-529-3111. When ex-Marine Walter Rainard went missing in September of 2002, the 66-year-old was in remarkably good shape for his age. He had no known medical issues, wasn't taking any type of medication, hiked up to 48 miles every week, and when he wasn't spending time in the wilderness, spent time at the gym for about 3 hours every day. At his retirement community in Oro Valley, Arizona, he had joined the hiking club, but for the most part, he liked to hike on his own, since the other people his age found it hard to keep up with him. On the 19th of September of that year, Walter decided to do some hiking in the Yosemite National Park, and when he didn't return to his home in the retirement village, he was reported missing. A search of the White Wolf trailhead, where he was last seen, led to his car being found, and with this clue to his last known whereabouts in hand, a search was started. Search dogs and helicopters were brought in. Boats scoured the water in the area, and employees from the park searched on foot, but they were unable to find any trace of him. His sons traveled to the park in hopes that they would find at least one clue, but to no avail. None of his clothing or equipment has ever been found, and Walter's fate remains a mystery to this day. In the days after his disappearance, the park was hit by 3 storms. Heavy rains pelted the area, but even worse, it had started to snow, and Walter's chances of surviving these harsh conditions lessened by the day. His family was hopeful that he found shelter in which to hunker down during the storms, and that he somehow managed to find some food and water, but they eventually stated that they knew the chances of Walter being found alive were very slim. Park officials told media outlets that foul play was not being considered a factor in the case, stating that they believed he either slipped and fell, got lost, or suffered a medical issue while out on the trail that day. Inside his car, investigators found the Swiss Army blade that Walter always carried with him, but it was known that he was carrying a fanny pack with him when he set out on his hike. One park employee would report that while he was closing down a lodge, he spoke to a man believed to be Walter. He stated that he spoke to the man at about 9 a.m. when he asked for directions to a lake that's located a few miles from the lodge. The man then headed in that direction, but he was never seen again. When his credit card activity was checked, it was showed that he last used it to fill his car with gas about 15 miles from the trail. A 15-mile radius around White Wolf trailhead was searched, but no further clues were found, and eventually the search was abandoned. Some areas containing perilous cliffs could not be searched, since those areas are too dangerous, even for professional searchers, and it's been suggested that Walter may have fallen into one of these areas. He's described as having gray hair and blue eyes, standing 5 foot 8 inches tall and weighing 145 pounds. When he was seen by the ranger, he was wearing a gray Alpine-style hat, hiking boots, and his fanny pack. If you saw Walter that day, or have any information about where he may be found, you're asked to contact the National Park Service at 888-653-0009. Jessie Hoover was 54 years old when she mysteriously disappeared from the Appalachian Trail in May of 1983, and her case is one that still baffles the authorities, since the circumstances surrounding her disappearance remain unknown. At the time, Jessie was living in White Settlement, Texas. She lived through a tragedy the previous year when her husband Eugene was struck by a car and lost his life. They'd been married for 35 years, and understandably, his passing had a profound impact on her. A few months after the tragedy, she started telling her family and friends that she wanted to hike from Maine to Georgia via the Appalachian Trail. She'd read about the arduous hike in a National Geographic magazine a few years earlier, and had always wondered what it would be like to complete the trail. Her family expressed their misgivings, stating that she may be too old to take the trail alone, but she would not be swayed from her plans. She laid out a carefully crafted itinerary, during which she would make regular stops to resupply her food and water, and if needed, she would ask her family to wire money. She visited her doctor before setting out to have her epilepsy medication refilled. and on the 16th of May, she put her plan into action. She started her trek in the 100-mile wilderness, which is so remote that hikers are warned to carry at least 8 days' worth of water with them. Almost 2 months later, on the 11th of July, her family became concerned when she hadn't checked in with them, and they reported her as missing. When an investigation was launched, it was discovered that despite her meticulous planning, Jessie was far from prepared for the hike, since she'd taken only a small amount of beef jerky to eat. Furthermore, she was dressed in light clothing that would give her very little protection from the elements at night. Park rangers reported that she had spoken to them about climbing Mount Katahdin, but they tried to dissuade her from doing so since she wasn't equipped for such an undertaking. A man working at the Old Abol Gatehouse reported that he saw Jessie sometime near the end of May as she was heading toward the 100-mile wilderness trail. But that was the last time that anyone had any contact with her. Searchers were at a loss as to where to start searching, since Jessie could have walked in any direction, and since the trails in that area aren't very well marked, she may have unwittingly ventured into the wilderness and gotten lost. Hikers who were present at the time were questioned, but no one had come across Jessie, and since temperatures were dipping below 40 degrees at times, there were very real concerns that she may have succumbed to hypothermia. Not a single piece of Jessie's clothing was ever found, and despite a massive search operation, she remains missing. Anyone who has any information on her whereabouts is asked to contact the Maine State Police Troop E at 207-973-3700. Many people hail the strange disappearance of 20-year-old Christopher Tomkins as the most mysterious case that they've ever come across. And looking at the details surrounding the mystery, it's easy to see why no reasonable explanation has ever been found. According to those who knew him, Christopher was a very hard-working and happy individual who was devoted to his Christian faith. At the time, he was living with his mother in Ellerslie, Georgia, and to make money, he was working for a surveying company in that area. On the 25th of June, 2002, the day that he vanished, he was scheduled to work as part of a 4-man surveying team, and he arrived at work at 8 a.m. He then traveled to a wooded area with one of his coworkers, and they started surveying an area close to County Line in Harris County. The team decided to work in a line formation, with each member staying about 50 feet from the next. Everything went to plan, and at around 1 p.m., they stopped work to have some lunch. They continued surveying at about 1:30, with Christopher being at the end of the line. His coworker would later tell the police that he and Christopher were busy having a conversation, but he had to check on something and turn his head for just a brief moment. When he looked back, he was shocked to find that Christopher was no longer there, which seemed impossible. He informed the other men of what had just happened, and they rushed to his work area, where they found his tools lying on the ground, but they were unable to find him. They tried to figure out what was going on, each stating that they never heard anyone walking or running through the woods. They thought that he may have walked a short distance into the tree line to relieve himself, but when he never returned, they started searching the immediate area to no avail, as they were unable to find any trace of him. One of the men used his cell phone to contact his wife and tell her what had happened, but they waited until 4:15 to notify his mother, a fact that many people familiar with the case find very strange. A missing person case was opened, and investigators rushed to the area. When the woods surrounding the work area were searched, the case only got stranger as one of Christopher's work boots was found hanging from a nearby barbed wire fence. A blue thread that's thought to be from his work pants was also found on the same fence, and below it they discovered some loose change that's thought to have possibly fallen out of his wallet. The area showed no signs that Christopher had been involved in a struggle, but no clues were found that could lead searchers in the right direction. The area was searched in vain, but 6 months later, a farmer was walking on his property, which is located a mile from the work site, and there he found Christopher's other boot. This was the last clue that was ever found, and it's been suggested that he may have been attacked by an animal, that he somehow injured himself, or that he vanished on purpose, but none of these theories have ever been proven. Anyone with information on Chris's case is urged to call the Harris County Sheriff's Office at 706-628-4211, though it should be noted that his case has officially been closed. A worrying clue has been uncovered in the case of the disappearance of 57-year-old Warren Meyer, who vanished from the Yarra Ranges National Park in Victoria, Australia, on the 23rd of March 2008. On that day, Warren decided to go for a hike in the park, and he had 2 trails to choose from. To this day, it isn't known which one he took, but both trails would have been very easy going, and he would have had no trouble completing either. By all accounts, even an inexperienced hiker would have easily walked these trails in about 4 hours, and Warren clearly knew this, since he made plans with his wife and a few of their friends to meet for lunch afterward that afternoon. Warren, who was about to retire from his civil engineering company, told his wife that he was only planning on walking about 3 miles into the trail, and that he would then turn around. But when he didn't show up for their lunch meeting, she became worried, and she, along with their friends, set out to look for him. They traveled to the Dum Dum Saddle area, where they found his car parked in the parking lot, but no sign of Warren. They phoned the national emergency number and reported him as missing, but were taken aback when the operator could be heard calling Warren silly and stating that he'd obviously gotten himself lost. Upon their arrival, Warren's wife told investigators that he was carrying a backpack containing his phone, a GPS device, a whistle, and some food and water. His phone was tracked and found to have last been active near a tower on the trail. No one could understand how Warren could have gone missing, since he was a very experienced hiker who'd completed some very challenging trails, and by comparison, the ones in this park would have seemed like no effort at all. This has led to speculation that he somehow stumbled across a crop of illegal plants that were being grown in the area, and as a result was either abducted or attacked. Nevertheless, more than 150 people joined the search effort, along with dogs, but nothing was found. While his wife was full of praise for the search teams, she feels that the police let Warren down, since they didn't make any inquiries into his disappearance. A witness reported hearing firearms being rapidly discharged as many as 200 times in the area that day, but this detail was never followed up on. The man who reported this was only interviewed months after the fact, by which time the case had already gone cold. Furthermore, Anthony Williams, a psychiatric patient with violent tendencies, was later confirmed to have been in the area on that day. But he was never considered a suspect, since the police found that there was only a 1-hour window during which they may have encountered each other, and he was never interviewed. Warren's disappearance was never solved, and it's unlikely that it ever will be. The authorities have asked that anyone who has any information as to what may have happened to him contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. On the 7th of October, 2013, 74-year-old Barnett Seldon and his wife Janet celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at the Golden Nugget Casino in Atlantic City. They had dinner at the Chart House restaurant, where they enjoyed some coconut shrimp and tilapia. He was planning on going hunting a few days later, and on the 9th of October, he traveled to the Bass River State Forest, where he intended to bait his tree stand. He planned to do this and then return to the stand a few days later to hunt deer, but he never got the chance as he suddenly and inexplicably disappeared. It's known that he arrived at the Audubon Club in Woodland, since he signed the register there at 9:55 a.m. that morning. But what happened to him after that remains a mystery that's unsolved to this day. When Barnett hadn't returned home 4 days later, he was reported missing, and a search effort was immediately underway. The New Jersey State Police and State Park Police made use of sniffer dogs and helicopters that searched from the air, and together they looked for Barnett in the Warren Grove recreational area, but could find no sign of him. His family started putting up flyers in the area and speaking to residents who lived near the park, but no one had seen Barnett, and he remained missing. His car was found during the search, and inside, his dog Taffy was found to be in good condition. But this only caused his family even more concern, since according to them, he would never have left her in the car if he hadn't been planning to return straight away. His keys were still in the car along with his cell phone, which was, of course, of no aid in tracing him. Fears for his safety were high, since he was known to be an avid hunter and experienced outdoorsman who wouldn't get easily lost. And since he remained missing, it was suggested that he may have encountered a wild animal or that he met with foul play. Janet stated that she wasn't too concerned when he didn't come home as planned, since he often stayed out in the woods for longer when he was hunting. But when she tried to call him and only got his voicemail, she knew something was wrong. His dog Taffy managed to survive by drinking rainwater that had entered the vehicle through its open windows, and she was returned to the family unharmed. But the fact that the bait that he was planning to use was still in the car, coupled with the fact that he suffered from type 2 diabetes, for which he requires medication, only made the situation much worse. Janet also revealed that he'd suffered several strokes in the past, but didn't know whether this may have been a contributing factor to his disappearance. Despite the best efforts of everyone involved, including Barnett's family and friends, no clues were ever found to explain what happened to him that day, and his case remains under investigation. If you have any information on Barnett's case, you're asked to contact the New Jersey State Police Missing Person Unit at 609-882-2000. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next